Hello, uh, my name's Sol Soler, and I'm the philosopher and theoretical physicist who's written the Principles of the Physics of Consciousness. And my last lecture was a statement of the principles of the physics of consciousness and a justification of those principles and an explanation of how they solve the hard problem of consciousness. So the first scientific theory, the first scientific set of principles that deal with consciousness and logically solve the hard problem of consciousness, and that can be used to construct theoretical models of conscious systems and that align with our everyday experience as physical and conscious entities. Okay, so check out those previous lectures on this channel. This lecture is entitled The Scientific Definition of Consciousness. Okay, so if we want to construct a physics of consciousness, we need a sound, technical, scientific definition of consciousness. And at the moment, apart from this definition, there are no valid scientific definitions of consciousness. So this is the first valid scientific definition of consciousness upon which you can actually build a workable, teachable and expandable physics of consciousness. So one of the strongest pieces of evidence in favor of my theory is that it's expandable, you can construct models with it, it's teachable, you can explain it to people, they can begin constructing models with it. Okay. So, the technical scientific definition of consciousness. I'm going to read through this document. I actually believe this is quite a special piece of writing. Well, hopefully you'll see why as we go on, and I'll explain why. So we begin with the requirements. Okay, so requirements for a scientific definition of consciousness. So the scientific definition of consciousness must satisfy the following. Be consistent with our scientific observations of the phenomenon of consciousness. 2. Be consistent with all existing, well-established theoretical and experimental physics. So has to align with quantum mechanics and has to work in, can't contradict Newtonian mechanics and things like that. It has to make sense with these other theories, well-established theoretical and experimental physics, which my theory does. It makes sense of quantum mechanics, for example, and Newtonian mechanics. Newtonian mechanics is an approximation to my theory, where consciousness has been set to 0. Okay, 3. Provide the basis for an expandable scientific physical theory of consciousness. Okay, I'll be showing in my later lectures to follow. Lectures immediately after this lecture will be applications of my theory to the real world and to conscious systems. Okay, so I'll show how to use the principles in this definition to construct theoretical models of conscious systems such as the human nervous system. 4. Be comprised of both. Now this is really important. This is the most important requirement of a scientific definition of consciousness. This is where all other definitions of consciousness, scientific definitions of consciousness, fail. It must be comprised of both an objective component as well as a subjective component. The objective and subjective components must be logically connected to one another in such a way that is consistent with the scientifically observed causal connection between the objectively described and defined physical brain and the subjective conscious experience subjectively experienced within the brain. Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's actually quite simple. We are physical entities and we are also conscious entities. Now, the conscious aspects of our existence are subjective. And here's the thing, they're purely subjective. This is related to the law of privacy, which I explained in my previous lectures. The only subjective conscious experience you can experience is your own. The only subjective conscious experience you can experience is the conscious experience within your own physical form. So there there's a subjective aspect to consciousness. The only reason we know consciousness exists is because we have subjective experience of consciousness. So a scientific definition of consciousness must take this into account, that there's a subjective aspect to the phenomenon of consciousness. And what does this mean? It means that our treatment of consciousness and our definition of consciousness cannot be purely objective. And historically, this is the big problem with all previous attempts at scientific theories of consciousness. They attempt to be purely objective. Why? Because historically, science is purely objective. Newtonian mechanics is purely objective. Quantum mechanics is purely objective. General relativity is purely objective. I mean, in quantum mechanics and general relativity, subjectivity is starting to kind of creep in. But there's still attempts at remaining strictly objective. But with consciousness, because it has purely subjective aspects to it, the definition and the treatment of consciousness cannot be purely objective. Okay, so that's where definitions of consciousness such as integrated information theory fail, because their definitions are attempts at purely objective definitions, which just consciousness isn't purely objective. So this has been a great impediment to a scientific theory of consciousness, because scientists are trained to think purely objectively and to analyze things purely objectively. But consciousness is this one phenomenon, that we can't analyze purely objectively. Why? Because it has purely subjective components. Okay, then the objective and subjective components must be logically connected to one another in such a way that makes sense of our empirical analysis of consciousness, particularly, the human body and the brain. We stimulate the brain, for example, with electrodes, and these cause changes in our subjective experience. So objectively observed things, such as stimulating the brain with electricity, which can be objectively described, causes changes in our subjective experience, in the patient's subjective experience. And our definition of consciousness must logically connect the objective with the subjective, which this definition does. Okay, so that's very important to understand. And the fifth requirement, the definition of consciousness must solve the hard problem of consciousness, of course. Okay, so those are the 5 requirements for a sound, workable definition, scientific definition of consciousness. Okay, let's move on. Part 1. So now we begin with all the different aspects of our definition of consciousness. So first we define consciousness as an energetic physical phenomenon. Okay? And what's our justification for this? Well, all the scientifically observed and defined physical phenomena of our universe are energetic phenomena. That is to say that according to modern physics, everything that has physical existence in our universe has been formed out of the original basic physical energy that was created in the Big Bang at t=0. Physics has only ever described and is only capable of describing physical energetic phenomena. Okay? Therefore, we define consciousness as a physical energetic phenomena of our universe. The existence of consciousness is grounded in the existence of the basic physical energy of our universe. If this physical energy didn't exist, neither would consciousness. Okay, so everything that exists in our universe, according to science, is formed out of and grounded in energy. So, since all the phenomena of our universe are grounded in energy, and since consciousness is a phenomena of our universe, we're going to say that, like all other phenomena of our universe, it's grounded in physical energy, which is just obvious. Okay, it's obvious if you're a scientist, because everything in science is grounded in energy. And yeah, other things, we can't make appeal to other universes or other dimensions or other substances, because these things are impossible. We're incapable of measuring or observing these things. All of our measuring apparatus, literally every single piece of physical scientific measuring apparatus, measures only energetic phenomena. It only measures things made out of energy within this universe, and it only measures things made out of energy within this universe within the 3 dimensions. the three normal space dimensions and one time dimension of our universe. Okay, so as soon as we make appeal to other universes that can't be measured, or other dimensions that can't be measured, or other substances that can't be measured, we know we don't have a scientific theory anymore. We have to stay within this. This is just the rules of science. We have to make reference only to this universe and only to the well-defined physical phenomena of this universe. So we can't say consciousness is some other new special conscious substance from some other universe or from some other dimension. That's just not science. It's science fiction, or it's maybe interesting speculation, but it's not science. Okay, part 2. Consciousness is an intrinsic fundamental property of all the physical energy of our universe. The physical energy created in the Big Bang at t equals 0 must have either possessed consciousness as an intrinsic fundamental property or not. Okay? There's just no two ways, well, there are only two ways about it. The energy created in the Big Bang either possessed consciousness, some consciousness within itself, or it didn't. It either is an intrinsic property or it's not. Okay. If not, then consciousness must be an emergent property, a property that has emerged out of physical energy at some time after t equals 0. Or it must be an intrinsic property that existed at t equals 0. As soon as the energy came into existence, it had some physical properties, and it also had the property of being intrinsically consciousness. There exist no other possibilities. Now, assuming that consciousness is an emergent property has proven a total logical and theoretical impasse. After a century of scientific endeavor, not a single logical scientific theory of consciousness has been constructed that solves the hard problem of consciousness. This is strong theoretical evidence that the assumption of emergent consciousness is incorrect. In dramatic contrast, when we assume that consciousness is an intrinsic property of all physical energy, the hard problem of consciousness is immediately solved. That's obvious. You are conscious because you are formed out of nothing except conscious energy and particles. And an expandable, logical, and intuitive and teachable scientific theory of consciousness can be very naturally and simply constructed. In analogy with conventional physics, such as Newton, I'm working in strong analogy with Newtonian physics, where you state well-defined laws and principles and you use them to construct theoretical models. Then if these theoretical models have wide-ranging applicability, then you can trust your principles. And that's why we can believe my theory. Therefore, we define consciousness as an intrinsic property of all the physical energy created in the Big Bang event. And we state the postulate of intrinsic consciousness. All physical energy possesses consciousness as an intrinsic property, and always has since the Big Bang event at t equals 0. In fact, physical energy is exactly equal to physical consciousness. E equals c. So that's my equation. The simplest equation ever written in physics. Capital E equals capital C. Energy and consciousness are the same thing. And it can just be experienced in two different ways, objectively and subjectively. Objectively is when you look at energy outside of your conscious experience. For example, I'm looking at a football now. In my bedroom, there's a football. There's two actually, I can see them. And they're made out of conscious energy, and I'm experiencing them objectively. I'm looking at them from without. And then physical energy can also be experienced subjectively. And that's my physical body. I'm experiencing that subjectively. I can feel some pressure on my foot because I'm sitting cross-legged. And, I'm thinking and I'm looking at my computer screen here, reading my essay. Okay, so that's the two. So it's the same stuff, but you're just experiencing it from within and from without, subjectively and objectively. Okay, but it's all physical consciousness. The physical energy of our universe can take on many different forms, and each form experiences within itself the subjective conscious experience corresponding to that form. This principle perfectly aligns with our scientific understanding of energy and physical matter. All matter is formed out of basic physical energy, and the exact physical properties of any material object depends on the physical configuration of that object. For example, we can form diamond or graphite from the same carbon atoms, and the different physical properties of these two substances depend on their respective physical configurations of the carbon atoms. Similarly, all subjective conscious states are formed out of physical energy, and the exact nature of a particular subjective conscious state depends on the physical configuration of the energy and particles within which the state is subjectively experienced. Okay, so you are a configuration of conscious energy and particles, and it's in some very complex, specific configuration that is yourself, and you experience the subjective conscious experience corresponding to exactly that configuration. Now, I have a very similar configuration because we're both humans. I presume I'm talking primarily to humans. So we have similar configurations: 2 eyes, a nose, 2 ears, stomach, nervous system, and a brain. And our brains are similarly constructed. We use the same parts of our brain for the same conscious functions. But there are some differences in our configurations. So, for example, if we look at the memory centers of your brain and compare them to the memory centers of my brain, their large scale structure would be the same, but there'd be difference in their small scale structure because you have different memories than me, because we've had different life experiences. So what happens is your experiences, they get kind of, let's say, written into the neurons of the memory center of your, stored in the neurons of the memory centers of your brain. So your neurons will be configured such that they give rise to your memories, your specific memories, and my neurons in the memory centers of my brain will be configured differently, such that they, when I examine them, they give rise to my specific memories. Okay. Part 3. Consciousness is not a purely objective phenomenon. The phenomenology of consciousness includes irreducibly subjective aspects. Okay? Again, I refer you to the law of privacy, which I explained in my previous lectures. The only subjective conscious experience you can ever directly observe is your own, and it's irreducibly subjective. So we can't analyze it purely objectively. Okay. Therefore, any purely objective definition of consciousness is necessarily incomplete. That's unavoidable. That's why all other definitions of consciousness till now are not correct. Therefore, a complete definition of consciousness will necessarily comprise an objective as well as a subjective component. Okay, so with that being established, we begin with the objective component of the scientific definition. So we'll have 2 components, the objective component and the subjective component. Okay, we've already defined consciousness as an energetic phenomenon, and then we've defined consciousness as being intrinsic to all energy, and now we define the objective component of the scientific definition of consciousness. Okay, here we go. Since, according to our definition, physical consciousness is exactly equal to physical energy, any statement about physical energy is also a statement about physical consciousness. So you have E equals mc squared. That's a statement about energy, and that's also a statement about physical consciousness, because physical consciousness is physical energy, but it's an objective statement. It's about physical consciousness when it's viewed objectively. And when it's viewed objectively, then it's exactly the same as when energy is viewed objectively, because consciousness and energy are the same thing. Okay. So any statement about physical energy is also a statement about physical consciousness. And since physics is the objective observation, description, and definition of physical energy, physics is also the objective observation, description, and definition of physical consciousness. Therefore, the technical scientific description and definition of the objective aspects of the physical phenomenon of consciousness is exactly equal to the technical scientific description and definition of physical energy as given by physics. In short, when physical consciousness is objectively observed, it appears as exactly equal to objectively observed physical energy. So all of physics, which is objective, traditionally till now, all of physics has been objective, and that is all statements about physical energy and different forms it can take on and different processes it can instantiate. And that is everything we say about physical energy is also true about physical consciousness. It's just the objective aspects of physical consciousness. So physical consciousness obeys laws like E equals mc squared. When you view it objectively, consciousness can exist. Consciousness can exist as energy, and it can also exist as matter, and it can convert from one to the other via E equals mc squared. So let's take an example with vision. You have rods and cones in the retina of your eye. Okay? Light energy, which is consciousness, physical consciousness, will impinge on your retina and be absorbed by the rods and cones of your eye. Okay? Now, the absorption of this light energy will increase the mass of your rods and cones. Or let's just talk about rods. I'm not sure, not an expert on eyesight, so I don't know exactly how rods and cones work. I have some vague idea, but I haven't studied it in detail. But anyway, we don't need to know the details for this particular argument. So the light energy will be absorbed by the rods in your retina. Now, this absorption of energy will increase the mass of the rod. When a rod absorbs a photon, its mass will increase. How much will its mass increase? Well, its mass will increase, given we can calculate how much its mass will increase, and we use the equation E equals mc squared to calculate how much its mass will increase. Okay? So that's the objective side of things. Then there's the subjective side of things. The subjective side of things is that a piece of physical consciousness, a photon, will be absorbed by your physical rod, and this absorption of the energy is a physical process, but it's also a conscious process, and it will cause a change in the conscious state within the rod in your eye. It will cause a change in the conscious state. So this absorption of the energy will increase its mass, and we can measure that objectively, but also within the rod, within the retina of your eye, it will cause a change experienced by the rod itself that we can't witness because we can't directly observe this because it's subjective. It happens within the rod. It will change its conscious state. Now then, your rod is connected to your optic nerve. And remember, we have localism. Nearby conscious events affect nearby conscious entities. Okay, so the rod is connected to the optic nerve of your eye. It will change the conscious state of the nerve. And then the nerve will change. The change in conscious state of the nerve will change the next nerve. Or, it's like the nerve fiber is like a line of nerve molecules. So there'll be one nearest the rod. Its conscious experience will change because of the change in the rod's conscious experience, which will change the nerve molecule next to it, which will change its conscious experience and its physical configuration. And that will change the nerve fiber, the nerve molecule next to it, and this will cause a chain of change in conscious experience all the way up to the visual centers of your brain. And this change in the visual centers in your brain, it gives rise to your visual consciousness, is your visual consciousness, okay? So that's how it works. There's objective and there's subjective. And we can objectively measure and observe and define physical processes, but then we have to subjectively deduce the subjective experience that takes place within them, which we have to do with reference to our own conscious experience, our own subjective conscious experience, because that's the only subjective conscious experience any of us ever is witness to. Okay. So in short, when physical consciousness is objectively observed, it appears as exactly equal to objectively observed physical energy. So our objective definition of consciousness is all of physics. Physical consciousness came into existence in the Big Bang, and it can take on many different forms, and it can instantiate many different processes. Okay? And physics is the objective definition of all the different forms it can take on, how these forms move through space, and the different processes that they can undergo and instantiate. And that's the objective. When we study consciousness objectively, it gives us physics, conventional objective physics. Okay. Now, my principles are the means by which we logically connect the objective with the subjective, and then we start filling in the map, the objective map, with subjective experience. Okay, so let's move on. 25 minutes. Okay, so that's good going. So now we move on. That's the objective component. Now we move on to the subjective component of the scientific definition of consciousness. Requirements. 1. It must be grounded in observations of subjective aspects of the phenomenon of consciousness. 2. Must be consistent with the scientifically observed causal relation between our objectively defined physical bodies and brains and the subjective conscious experience that we privately and subjectively experience within our respective bodies and brains. Okay, so we've been objectively studying the human form, the human body, and the human brain, and neuroscience is the detailed study, objective study of the human brain. Okay, so that's the objective study of human consciousness, is what neuroscience is. And then we have to link that to our subjective experience. And neuroscientists have already been complying with this definition for decades. Because what they do is they do something to the brain, they do some physical experiment to the brain, and then they ask the patient, what did you feel then? Or how did it change your conscious experience? What did you they stimulate the visual centers and then ask the patient, what did you see? They have to refer to the patient. They have to ask the patient about the conscious experience because they can't see the conscious experience. All the neuroscientists can see are neurons. And we know that's we don't experience our conscious experience doesn't look like neurons at all. Neurons look like, little spider webs. You don't, within yourself, you don't experience just little spider webs, and they don't have any color. Within yourself, you experience color, and you can close your eyes and imagine a tree, for example. Now, when the neuroscientists look inside your brain or scan your brain while you're imagining a tree, they don't see a tree. They just see neurons all the time. So they have to refer to the patient and say, what did you experience when we did this? So they cause physical changes in your brain, but then they ask the patient, what was the subjective change in your experience? So they're already complying with this definition, which is what's great about this definition, is it fits perfectly with neuroscience and how the practical science of neuroscience. Okay. So already neuroscience is connecting, the study of neuroscience is connecting the objective configuration of the brain with the subjective experience, and the subjective experience is always necessarily reported by the patient in question, because subjective experience can only be experienced subjectively by the person themselves. Okay, so first we define the law of privacy. The law of privacy. The only way to observe any subjective conscious experience is to be the same physical entity or object forming and experiencing it. Okay, so you are the object that experiences your consciousness, and that's why you get to experience it. I am not the same physical object as you, and that's why your conscious experience is totally private to you. I can never see your thoughts or read your mind or feel your feelings. Okay, equivalently, subjective conscious experience can only be observed subjectively. For example, you're the only person capable of observing the subjective conscious experience created by your own physical body and brain. We can observe, scan, and dissect your brain on any scale we want, but we will only ever observe the objective aspects of your consciousness, such as objectively defined particles and neurons, etc. We are never able to observe your subjective conscious experience. This means that the only subjective conscious experience any scientist has ever or can ever observe is their own. Okay, so this is really important. Every scientist, everyone studying consciousness, the only consciousness that they have ever experienced, you, me, every scientist ever, the only conscious experience they have ever experienced is their own. And that means that everyone's definition of consciousness must refer to their own experience of consciousness. Okay? That's what's important about this definition. It refers to human consciousness. It refers to each scientist's personal experience of consciousness. Okay. And then we expand outward from there. Okay, so all science. Before me, with Newton and Einstein and everyone, all science has begun with human experience. Like we start on Earth, examining and investigating the Earth, and then we move outwards from there to describe the solar system and the whole universe. And similarly with consciousness, it begins and is always grounded in our experience of human consciousness, because that's the only experience of consciousness we ever have. It's the only reason we know consciousness exists. Okay, it is an inescapable fact following from all our experience and investigation of the phenomenon of subjective consciousness that your definition of consciousness must necessarily be based on your own personal subjective experiences of consciousness, whereas my definition must be based on my own personal subjective experiences of consciousness. Denial of this fact is the reason why the science of consciousness has floundered so fruitlessly for such a long time. Therefore, there exists only one possible definition of the subjective aspect of consciousness. Okay, here we go. Now this is really important. Subjective component of the scientific definition of consciousness. Okay, at any given time t, the exact configuration of conscious energy and particles forming your physical self, including your physico-conscious connections to your local surrounding universe, subjectively experiences within itself exactly the subjective conscious experience that you experience at the same time t. Okay, more simply put, okay, so that was just gave a very technical scientific definition, and now more simply we can just say your subjective conscious experience at any moment is exactly the conscious experience experienced by conscious energy and particles configured into exactly your physical form at that moment. Okay? So what we're saying is that energy came into existence in the Big Bang, and this energy was intrinsically conscious, and you can put it into different forms. And within each different form, there will be a different subjective conscious experience. Okay, and what we can say is that when we configure energy and conscious energy and particles into exactly your physical configuration at any time t, whatever you are subjectively experiencing at that time is what particles arranged into that form, conscious particles arranged into that form, experience when they're arranged into that form. Okay, so that's how we link the objective with the subjective. So we can study, measure, define the human physical form, and then you yourself within that form, you know what conscious experience it gives rise to. And then we can systematically start analyzing and describing the conscious experience that goes with different physical forms. So we know that when we configure conscious energy into an eye with an optic nerve and connect it to a visual center in the brain within a healthy functioning human body, that all of that together gives rise to conscious experience, to our human visual conscious experience. And then we could analyze the eye of a dog, and we could see, oh, the dog's eye differs in this way and in that way, so it sees in a different range of wavelengths, and it has a different resolution, and so on and so forth. So then we get insight into how a dog sees based on examining the physical construction of its eye and how it differs from ours, but it has to be grounded in our own experience of visual consciousness. Like, as everyone knows, if someone's been blind from birth and has never ever seen any colors whatsoever, you can never explain to them what the color yellow is, for example. So you might be, that blind person will still be able to learn all about physics and learn how the eye is formed and learn all the technical objective descriptions of an eye, but it will never understand what visual perception is like, because that's purely subjective and it has to be witnessed you have to consciously experience it to know what the conscious experience is like. Okay, but anyway, that's how we connect the objective physical configurations with the subjective experience. So your subjective conscious experience at any moment is exactly the conscious experience experienced by conscious energy and particles when they are configured into exactly your physical form at that same moment. Okay. That might take a little bit of reflection to get straight in your head. But but that's essential to a true physics of consciousness. And that's why all other definitions of consciousness fail. Because they're trying to analyze consciousness purely objectively, and it's not purely objective, so it can't be done. Okay, part 5. Similar configurations of conscious energy and particles experience similar subjective conscious experiences within themselves. This is proven by biology and neuroscience. So this is the principle of similar forms. This is proven by biology and neuroscience. Conscious energy and particles configured into an eye connected to a brain experience subjective visual conscious experiences within themselves. The same particles arranged into a stomach connected to a brain experience subjective conscious experience of hunger and satiety. If this principle wasn't true, it would be impossible to reliably identify different parts of the brain with their respective subjective conscious experiences. This principle of similar forms is how, despite the law of privacy, we can systematically deduce the conscious states of different conscious entities under different circumstances. For example, we can tell what type of visual subjective conscious experience a fish, say, experiences based on the objective investigation of its eyes with reference to our own personal subjective visual conscious experience. See my essay on fish consciousness. So yeah, if you're interested, I have an essay called Fish and the Principles of the Physics of Consciousness, which goes into more detail as to how we deduce the conscious experiences of other creatures apart from ourselves. I'll link that in the description. That's well worth it. It's not very long. It's a very interesting essay. Fish and the Principles of the Physics of Consciousness. Okay, yeah, and one more thing. I forgot to mention the definition of consciousness, including your physico-conscious connections to your local surrounding universe. So yeah, it does depend on how you are in physical connection with your local universe. For example, if your eyes are open, then light is streaming into your eyes and connecting with your retina, and that's changing your subjective experience as well. So your connections to your surrounding universe have to be taken into account when we're defining the objective aspects of your subjective experience. Okay, but I think that's fairly obvious. Part 6. Okay, so that was the principle of similar forms. Now we move on to part 6. All individual conscious entities possess limited free will. So you possess limited free will, and so do electrons. And the reason you possess limited free will is because you're formed out of entities that each individually possess limited free will, and they combine into more complex entities, such as a human. The collapse of the wave function is a conscious act. If all energy is conscious, then all the basic particles formed out of this energy are definable conscious entities. So I'm talking about quantum entities are definable conscious entities. Singular, individual quantum entities, particles, photons, etc. are singular, individual conscious entities. As I have shown in my essays on quantum mechanics, the simplest and most logical way of interpreting the experiments of quantum mechanics is to assume that each quantum entity is a conscious entity capable of choosing from limited sets of possible future states to instantiate, such as where exactly to land on a screen, or spin up or spin down in a magnetic field, for example. See my essays on quantum mechanics and limited free will for a more detailed description of quantum consciousness. Here is an essay on quantum free will. Okay, so I'll link that essay as well, Quantum Free Will and the Principles of Consciousness. That will require a little bit of study so that you can see the first simple and logical interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics that proves all this. Quantum mechanics and consciousness are twin mysteries, and solution of the one solves the other. But yeah, you are intrinsically conscious because you are formed out of particles that are intrinsically conscious. You have limited free will. You can choose from limited sets of future possibilities and future states to instantiate. You can choose to like or not like. You can choose to subscribe or not to subscribe. And just, my theory, as I say, makes sense of our everyday conscious experience. So it's important that as you contemplate this theory, that you refer it to your own everyday experience and see, does this theory make sense of my everyday experience? And it will, Because now, for example, you have a choice, like or not to like. That's a very simple choice, a very limited set of possibilities. You can like, dislike, or do neither. And you can just contemplate that and feel that as a choice that's available. It's just an intrinsic capacity that you have. Like some properties and some abilities are just intrinsic and fundamental. And some properties have to be fundamental. If something has no fundamental properties, then it can't exist. Then it doesn't exist. You need fundamental properties to exist. And one fundamental aspect of our universe is that the stuff of our universe can make choices between limited sets of possible future states. That's how the universe goes from the Big Bang, which is an exceedingly simple state, just energy condensed into one point, how it goes from there to this much more complex state that we're in now, where there are billions of stars and galaxies, and there's the Earth and us and football stadiums and all the human mayhem that's taking place now. That's because all of us are making conscious choices all day long. And these conscious choices are free conscious choices. They're just limited. They're limited by our physical forms. Like, you can't do anything you want. You can choose to like or dislike, or neither, but you can't choose to fly out of your window. Why? Because of your physical form. So our free will is constrained by our physical form and by the physical form of the universe around us. You can't fly now because the gravitational field is too strong. So the universe around us puts constraints on us. If the gravitational field was much weaker, you could jump 50 feet into the air, for example. Okay, so that's the essay on quantum free will. I'll link in the description. That's well worth to read as well. Okay, yeah, and that does take a little bit of study. You have to listen to my essay, The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness, to see the simple logic, see how simply and logically intrinsic consciousness makes sense of quantum mechanics, which for 100 years hasn't made any sense. Okay, further considerations. We can see that this definition perfectly aligns with our scientific investigation of consciousness. Neuroscience proves beyond all reasonable doubt that consciousness is grounded in the existence of physical energy, the physical neurons and microtubules and stuff of our brain, and oxygen and all these things that we need for our normal human consciousness. Objective inspection of the brain on all scales proved that subjective conscious experience is objectively unobservable. That's the law of privacy. And when neuroscientists investigate how changes in the physical configuration of the brain affect the subjective conscious experience of the patient, they must rely on the subjective testimony of the patient herself in order to confirm the correlations between the objective and subjective aspects of consciousness. My definition of consciousness also immediately solves the hard problem of consciousness, as well as allows for the construction of simple, intuitive, and obvious physics of consciousness, including the first intuitive and logical interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics, which itself allows for a quantum theory of free will, limited free will, that perfectly aligns with our subjective conscious experience of free will. So yeah, a lot of modern scientists are trying to convince you that free will doesn't exist. Well, one, they have no good theories of consciousness, so their theory isn't, their claims aren't grounded on good, sensible theories of consciousness that solve the hard problem. And two, their claim that you don't have free will is in direct contradiction of your everyday experience. Because of your everyday experience, fine, there are lots of influences in your whole life. Your past history does influence what decisions you make, but you do experience all day of your life, every day of your life, you do experience being able to freely choose between limited sets of possibilities, to like or to dislike, for example, or not to like at all. And you can, and fine, maybe you don't like my ideas at all, so your mind is already made up for you, so it's not a free choice, but you can make free choices between things that you have no investment in whatsoever. Like, I can tell you to click the fingers of your left hand or to click the fingers of your right hand, and you can choose which one to do, and you can freely do that. Again, you have to refer to your own experience. Does it not feel every day of your life that you are freely choosing what you do? There are influences on you, and sometimes you don't freely choose. Like, if there's a fire in your house or something, then you just run away from the fire. But when you're at peace, you can just choose what to do, and our whole human existence proves free will, really, and creativity. The freedom of creativity, all our art, our jokes, the way we dance, improvisation, jazz, all these things are such strong testimony to irreducible creativity and free will. But you have a lot of modern scientists who they're brainwashed basically by old ways of viewing the world scientifically, and scientifically everything's supposed to be objective, but it just doesn't work. It works for macroscopic objects, simple macroscopic objects. And I can explain why it works for simple macroscopic objects, but it doesn't work for humans. We're more complex than that, and we have free will, and it doesn't work for basic individual particles. In quantum mechanics, quantum mechanics shows that when you isolate an individual particle, that is, so if you have a macroscopic object, it's many millions of particles bound together into a ball or a brick or a bowling ball or something like that. And then you can analyze it deterministically using Newtonian mechanics, but that's just an approximation. What the quantum physicists showed is that when you isolate a single individual particle or atom or molecule, then you can't predict its behavior. Quantum mechanics shows the basic free will of individual entities in our universe. Quantum mechanics is bound groups of individuals, and then they behave in such a way that Newtonian mechanics works. But then when we try and apply it to humans are much more complex, and they have a central nervous system, which is very important, which creates one central point of consciousness that can make decisions freely. And that's why Newtonian mechanics doesn't apply to humans at all. It just doesn't work. We're unpredictable. We have free will, which is great news. But yeah, do pay attention to yourself throughout the day, throughout your life, and see how you just intrinsically are capable of choosing between different sets of possibilities, Coke or Pepsi, whatever, and how sometimes you can be contrary. Maybe you prefer Coke, but sometimes you just say, you know what, I feel like just having a Pepsi. Or you might just be trying to be strange or surprise someone, so you order a Pepsi, just even though they know Coke is your favorite, you order a Pepsi. Anyway, that's for another lecture. In another lecture, I want to dedicate a full hour or more to intrinsic free will and explain how my theory makes sense of free will, and how determinism, which works for simple macroscopic objects, is just only works for simple macroscopic objects, and it's just an approximation. Okay, so there we go. That is the technical scientific definition of consciousness, and you can compare it to other modern definitions of consciousness and see why they fail. Like integrated information theory tries to give a purely objective definition of consciousness, which just won't work because consciousness is not purely objective. So they say consciousness is integrated information. Well, then they don't explain anything else. Information is formed out of energy. Whatever integrates information is also formed out of energy, such as your brain, for example. And they don't explain how this energetic interaction, how the energy formed as information, being involved in a process with the energy formed into whatever is integrating the information, they don't explain how the consciousness switches on. So it's not a good definition. It doesn't have a subjective component. Okay. So, yeah. That's it, really. Yeah, I can imagine that would take some time to think over and ponder. But yeah, what's important is that we have to realize that our understanding of consciousness is grounded in our own experience of consciousness. That's the key point. And that's what this definition does. It links the objective study of our physical forms with our subjective experience of consciousness. Okay. So, yeah, if you have any doubts about that, anything you'd like me to clear up, and I'm sure you will, of course, because, this is a lot of new physics. There's a lot of new, there's a lot to explain. But yeah, in my next lectures, I'm going to show applications of the principles of physics, of the physics of consciousness. And yeah, coming soon will be an entire lecture dedicated to free will. The illusion of determinism. Newtonian mechanics creates an illusion of determinism that but that illusion is only valid over a certain range of phenomena, particularly simple macroscopic objects. Quantum mechanics proves free will, and your everyday experience of conscious life proves free will. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you in the next one. All the best.